Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to the OBS Pod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter anyone else that's interested, the OBS Pod is for you. Episode 181, Assisted Vaginal Birth, A Woman's Perspective. I have with me today a special guest, Jacqueline Edwards, and Jacqueline got in touch with me after hearing my episode and perhaps a little video I did on assisted vaginal birth, and we've had a bit of an exchange, haven't we, about your experiences, good and bad, of assisted vaginal birth. So I don't know if we should start, Jacqueline, with perhaps you telling us a little bit about who you are and why you got in touch with me.
Yeah, that's fine. So, as I say, my name's Jacqueline. I'm a mum to 5 children, a grandmother to 1. So my 2 elder sons are both grown up now, and I have my 3 daughters still living at home. My eldest son is 28. My youngest daughter is 4. So I've had my children over a couple of decades and seen different things happening during those years. But also, I think importantly, I've had, 5 quite different births. I would originally, if I could rewind time and from day dot, I would always have planned to have a home birth. In fact, I did with my first, and that's consistently what I wanted. Unfortunately, I've ended up having 3 home birth transfers, and they ended up being the instrumental birth, the assisted vaginal birth. I've also had 1 home birth, and I've had a pre-labour C-section. So I was told technically it's not an elective section, but I wasn't in labour. And I'd say out of all of them, the 2 most positive ones were the home birth and the C-section, which I never thought I'd find myself saying, because when I, with my first, before I'd ever given birth, a C-section was like the last option, and it was the most like disastrous kind of birth I could have imagined, but it ended up being very positive and empowering for me. Whereas the assisted vaginal births, less so. And I'd say in terms of mental health, they're the ones that have impacted me the most and had a longer impact on my mental health, which is why I just feel now that I'm finished having babies, I know I won't be having any more. I wanted to just kind of help to improve things for those coming after me. And I'm not medically trained in any way, just like, a member of the public, a mum having babies in different ways. And I just feel like I've kind of almost like an expert in what it feels like because I've had 3 of them, the instrumental births, that I wanted to share it back from the woman's point of view of how that feels, what can be positive about it and what feels negative about it. And that's one of the reasons I got in touch with you, Florence, because I thought as much as I can tell other women about it, sometimes, it needs to be a bit higher up in terms of who we share it with to enable, practice to be even just slightly adjusted to make it a more positive experience for women. And that's what I'm hoping to do now with talking to you in this podcast.
Yes, and I think you're right. It's really valuable for us as professionals, whether that's midwives or doctors listening to this, or women who are going to give birth. It's really important for us to understand how we make people feel and realise the implications that we may or may not see. So, as you know, I've done lots of work on women's experience of maternity care, and when I talk to women, they always show me something new. There's always a blind spot. You think you're an expert in something, and then someone shows you a new idea or a new aspect you haven't thought about.
Yeah.
And in preparation for today, we've exchanged a few emails, and I definitely thought, oh yeah, there's stuff here that's definitely worth talking about. So I really appreciate you getting in touch and having this conversation with me, because I know it's not easy necessarily to go through, particularly when things are less good,
Yeah.
and the sort of long-term consequences that can have
Yeah.
on you. So thank you very much for being willing to share your experiences.
Mhm.
You mentioned to me that you had a forceps birth,
Yeah.
which a lot of people might see as a very negative type of birth, or very interventional type of birth. And you had a ventouse birth, which people might see as a possibly less traumatic inducing type of birth. But actually, in your experience, it was the reverse, that actually the forceps was better than the ventouse, and that some aspects of that, or a large amount of what contributed to that, was communication. Do you want to talk a little bit about those experiences?
Yeah, so I've had the two, my first birth and my last birth were both ventouse. The forceps was my second birth. And as you say, from the outside, it kind of seems, well, forceps, it's kind of potentially caused more damage. It seems it's more of an intervention rather than just having a little suction cup on top of the baby's head. And yeah, I can kind of see that. But my experience personally with the ventouse births, particularly the last one, it was, yeah, there were lots of aspects to it that just made it more traumatic. So I think the negatives of them were, with both my first and my last one, the pain was just excruciating. And again, you would imagine with forceps there would be more pain, but I think, but neither of them were done with any pain relief. My first one, to be fair, was 28 years ago. So I've no idea what policy was then. My last one was 4 years ago, and I do know what the policy is because I've read all the RCOG guidelines. And normally it would have been a spinal anaesthetic, or if not, a pudendal block. And I didn't get either of those. And so at one point, the point that always sticks in my mind when I think about the birth and when I've done so much therapy is the part where I'm screaming out where the doctor is attempting to attach the suction cup to my baby's head. And the pain was excruciating, and that just caused so much trauma. And even if I have no idea how long that took, but the fact that it was so painful and knowing afterwards unnecessarily so, it just caused more trauma basically. So that was one thing, the amount of pain, that physical pain that I experienced. Also, just not the whole consent process, it just wasn't done in a way that you would imagine any other medical procedure would be done in terms of informed consent. Now, as I say, I'm coming at this from the don't like to use patient, technically we're not really patients, are we? But I'll use that term anyway, a patient's point of view.
Mm.
And I'm sure it's very different from a doctor's point of view. And I'm sure there's so much difference to a woman being pregnant, having a discussion with an obstetrician about options and pros and cons, to a woman actually being in labour and you're trying to give this information between contractions. So I appreciate how difficult it is, but I do think that same principle of informed consent should always be there, no matter what the
Mm.
situation. I just feel with both of them, it was almost like the doctor kind of gave me enough information to get me to consent to what he'd already decided he wanted to do. So I was given
Mm.
all the pros of the intervention, but without any of the cons, and without really going through things like what would happen in terms of episiotomy. So I think it was just that whole process wasn't done in the way that it should be done. And that really had a big impact. I mean, at the time it's difficult because you're thinking, well, I just want the baby born. But,
Yes.
it carries on much longer than that. And, when you kind of ruminate and think back to what happened, I think actually, no, neither of them were a medical emergency. It was both slow second stage with both of them. Baby
Mm.
wasn't in stress. There was time. It wasn't a
Yes.
case, when your baby's heart's gone, through the floor, this baby has to come out now. I mean, even then, technically, you're still supposed to inform consent, but I can
Yes.
appreciate the time in that, it just doesn't allow it. But for me, the time did allow it. And, things like an episiotomy could have been discussed. There was time to put, to administer a pudendal block. As far as I'm aware, it's quite, quick, straightforward.
Yes.
And epidural would have been a much longer process. But, it's just little things like that it was almost like I felt like I was collateral damage. It's like, well, let's just get the baby out. She'll be
Mm.
fine. That kind
Yes.
of attitude, as in, doesn't matter if she has to go through a lot of pain. She'll live. She'll be fine, and we'll get the baby
Yes.
out. that's what I found very negative about that. Time allowed for things, and those things that should have been done weren't done. It was almost like,
Yes.
well, can't be bothered, or I don't care, or do you know what I mean? I don't know what was
Yeah.
going through the time, but from my point of view, it's like, just can't be bothered, should be fine. You know what I mean? It was
Yes.
that
Yeah.
kind of attitude, really.
Yeah. I think so. Absolutely. Pudendal block is quite quick and easy to do. I think it is something that has some skill that I think our trainee obstetricians are perhaps less experienced in pudendal block than perhaps we were when I was training, because we give spinals much more readily these days, or epidurals. But absolutely, it's a relatively quick and, surprisingly effective procedure, actually. I really do find it works. So it's an injection of local anesthetic around the pudendal nerve on each side. So you have an injection each side in the vagina with some
Mm-hmm.
local anesthetic, and then usually some local anesthetic into the perineum. And you need to wait a little bit for it to work, but not very long, maybe
Yeah.
5 minutes or so.
Yeah.
So absolutely, there is no excuse for not
Yeah.
giving you some pain relief. I'm interested because I wonder, so we talk a lot in healthcare about bias, and there's all sorts of bias, but I'm wondering whether there was a bias or an assumption. Well, you've had four babies before, you've
Mm,
had all
mm,
these births before
mm,
with
mm.
varying degrees of intervention. So I'm wondering whether that biased staff, because I sometimes feel that when women have had babies before, there is a little bit of a attitude of, well, she's just going to crack on and it's all going to be fine because she's done it before.
Mm.
And I don't know if that was coming into play at all, but I'm wondering if that was part of the mindset. And in terms of consent, I think you're right. Antenatal education is really lacking in provision in terms of what maternity services provide these days. There's a bit, and we give lots of information with QR codes and websites and etc. But I think really the time and place to have those conversations is in the pregnancy, so that
Mhm.
when a woman's faced with a decision in the heat of the moment, she already knows what she's talking about because she's talked about it before. 36 weeks, one of the main aims of the 36-week antenatal appointment with the midwife is to have some conversations about birth preferences and birth options and what expectations that woman has and how she'd like to give birth and what pain relief and so on. So maybe it needs to be better wrapped up into that conversation, particularly if you're having your first baby, because we know an assisted vaginal birth is much more common in a
Yeah.
first labour. It might be as high as 1 in 3 women having their first vaginal birth will have some form of assistance.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely agree. Both of those things, actually, that just going back to what you said originally, was there some kind of, oh, well, it's her fourth vaginal birth, blah, de, blah. Even like I've got a midwife friend, and she said the same thing. Midwives, I won't go into all the details, but I didn't find out until after I had my last baby that I've actually got a hypertonic pelvic floor. This is the reason why I've had these difficult I have like textbook first stage labours,
Mm,
easy, baby's always head down, perfect position, no issues with the baby. But then I have this issue with my pelvic floor. And my midwife friend was saying, yeah, we always assume that once a woman's had like a couple of babies, she's going to have this quick, easy second stage. And it's kind of that assumption. I think that's part of the reason why I ended up with this instrumental birth last time. So I've been pushing for an hour. Baby had progressed. She'd moved down a couple of
yes.
stations. But because it was my fourth vaginal birth and I've been pushing for an hour and she hadn't moved, well, this is what we'd expect. There was that assumption, as in, well, we have to intervene now because something's not quite right because she hasn't
Mm,
progressed fast as she should have done, without actually speaking to me and saying, oh, well, what were your others? Do you know what I mean? What happened?
yes.
If they'd have asked me, I'd have said, actually, yeah, you know what? I have really long pushing stages.
Yeah.
And there's something going on. I didn't know at the time what it was. I've since found out from having visiting pelvic physiotherapists. I'd say, yeah, this is normal for me. This is
Yes.
fine. But
Yes.
as long as you moved a bit, that's fine. That's normal. And it's not. So yeah, there was definitely an assumption there. And whether again the assumption was, oh well, a baby's passed through a vagina 3 times already. She won't need any pain. She'll be fine. Like you say,
Yeah.
she'll put on. She won't feel anything. But I think those assumptions are difficult because we're all different. We've all got different pain thresholds. And it could be that the woman that they performed that intervention on yesterday, last week, didn't have an epidural in place, didn't need anything, and she was absolutely fine. But I think you have to go with what the woman who is the most sensitive and has the lowest pain threshold and at least offer that. And
Mm.
you might say, no, I don't fancy that injection into my vagina or whatever. I'll just crack on with it. Whereas another woman will be like, yeah, actually, when I go to the dentist, I need like maximum pain relief. Give me the max
Yes.
for this
Yeah.
thing you're now going to do to me. So I think those assumptions, yeah, it must be quite difficult as a practitioner when you've seen like what the norm is in inverted commas, but you're always going to have people outside of the norm, and they're
Yes.
the ones
Yes.
you have to always have in mind every single time. What if this woman has a low pain threshold? We have to go with the assumption that you have that, and if you don't, that's fantastic. So I
Yes.
think that those assumptions definitely are things that should be challenged every single time you have this situation
Yes.
in front
Yes.
of you.
I'm interested in what was the midwife involvement in this, because you've been pushing some time, and
Yeah,
then what happens is the midwife comes out and talks to the midwife in charge and says, oh, I
yeah,
need a doctor's review or whatever. And the midwife presumably had been with you for some hours and got
yes,
to know you a bit.
yeah,
And I always think the midwife is there, we're coming in to maybe assist, but the midwife is still your key person and your key
yeah,
advocate. So I'm interested, perhaps for midwives listening or student midwives listening, what role the midwife played in this. If were they
yeah.
saying to the doctor, hang on a minute, do this, and he was ignoring them, or were they passive, or what was happening?
Yeah, I did find them quite passive actually. So I did as I say, I transferred in from a home birth. I was like post dates. My baby was post dates, and when my waters broke, we transferred in because when my waters broke, there was meconium, but she was never in distress at any point, and it was just one of those cases of. I've since read that 30% of babies who are post dates can have meconium
Mm.
in waters. Obviously, at the time, I didn't know this. I just thought meconium was the scary thing. So they said, "Let's go," and I'm not saying what they did was wrong, advising me to transfer in, and I did willingly transfer in. And as a plus, the two home birth midwives, in theory, should have kind of handed me over to the hospital midwives, but they stayed with me because I didn't have a support person. Long story short, so they stayed with me almost as my support people. Then obviously I had the hospital midwife, and then I had the labour ward midwife coming in as well. But I did find, to be honest, even and with my first one, almost once an obstetrician comes in the room, I found personally the midwives are quite passive, and it's
Mm.
almost like they don't like to challenge the doctor. So, for example, with the pain relief, I was screaming with the pain, and the midwife, one of the midwives from the hospital, the labour ward midwife, was just saying, right, you need to stop screaming, you need to calm down, listen. So it was almost like she wasn't even on my side, so to speak. It was
Right.
almost like advocating. I felt she was advocating for the doctor here
Right.
instead of me. And then
Yeah.
one of the other midwives did, and I remember just saying, "Oh, but it really, really hurts." And one of the midwives said, "Here, have some gas and air." So at that point, I did have a bit of pain relief. It was
Yes.
gas and air, it was better than nothing. But I just thought afterwards, why didn't they hand me that gas and air before the doctor started the procedure? I mean,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
it was the doctor's job and duty to ensure that I had pain relief in place. But given that he didn't, and that given that the midwives you're advocate, there was 4 midwives in the room at that point.
Mm.
Four. Not one of them thought, hang on a minute, let's
Yeah.
just see
Yeah.
it until after I'd started screaming. So yeah,
Yeah.
I did feel as bad as I feel, as angry as I feel towards the doctor, because I did feel angry. I actually felt more anger towards the midwives because
Yes.
they're my advocates. Yes, he failed to do his job, but so did they, and they're women. And at the very least, they know what even a smear feels like.
Yeah.
Whereas the
Yeah.
doctor, he was male, he didn't have a clue. I'm not
Yeah.
saying that's an excuse, but from an emotional point of view, it's like, hang on, there's 4 of you, 4 women in this room.
Yes.
Why
Yeah,
are you
yeah,
being so passive and not kind of doing your job of being my advocate, or just saying, stop, just hang on, let's just give her a bit of gas in it.
yeah,
I
yeah,
transferred from a home, so I didn't have an epidural in place, nothing. And I was already in significant pain because I had a very quick labour. It'd come on very, very quickly at home. So I
yeah,
was already in a lot of pain anyway because I didn't have time to build up all, the endorphins and the
yeah,
natural pain. Then you transfer from hospital, from home to hospital. That in itself makes labour more painful because it's this, you've got the stress, you've
yeah,
got the adrenaline. So I was in a bad situation to
yeah,
start with. And then it was just about to be made worse by this type of birth that
yeah,
was happening. Once the doctor walked in the room, it's almost like, right, this is their territory now, and
yeah,
they're going to kind of take over. That's how it felt from
yeah.
my point of view. You know,
Yes. Okay.
yeah.
Perhaps if we turn to slightly better, the say a little bit about your forceps birth and what was better about that, or how you felt the communication was better or cared for in that situation.
Yeah, so this was my second birth. I'd had quite a big gap. I'd had 9 years between my first two. I decided to pay for an independent midwife because my first birth had been so traumatic. I thought I'm going to give myself the best chance. So because I had the independent midwife, it was the one-to-one care. We had so this is really good antenatal care. Lots of long appointments for an hour or more where we go into what happened last time and what if you're in that situation. And so we had lots of time to prepare
Mm.
for this eventuality. And unfortunately, it did happen. And what I remember, one of the things I said is, if I do go into hospital, if I do transfer into hospital, it's because something's going wrong. At that point, I want an epidural. I don't care what they're going to do to me. They're going to intervene in some way. And I'm not going through any kind of birth, hospital birth, with
Mm.
interventions, without pain relief. So I think that in itself helped because I already had a good plan, as you say, getting back to women during pregnancy, having this really good solid plan in place. If this does happen,
Mm.
none of them want it to happen because it's not a choice, is it? No woman puts on a birth plan, I want my baby pulled out by forceps.
Yes, exactly.
It's not anything anyone's planned for. So it's like, in the eventuality of this happening, this is what I'd like. And because I'd had the ventouse birth to start with, I had a good idea of what was going to happen, what would be
Mm.
done to me, how that would feel. So I said, under no circumstances am I having any instruments without an epidural. And if they won't do it, then they'll have to do a C-section. That's it. There's nothing. You're not touching me without an epidural. So I had that in place. I had really good support of the midwife who transferred in with me, someone I
Mm.
knew really well. Unfortunately, when we got there, we did have a doctor who didn't understand like why I would want an epidural, because you've got this far and you've been pushing for hours. Why do you
Mm.
need it? As if because of what you want to do to me now is
Mm.
going to be the part that's going to, I can cope with the natural pains of labor and pushing a
Yeah.
baby out. It's all these other things you want to do to me that are going to really, really hurt me. In the end, he kind of huffed and puffed, went out, but he knew that he couldn't do anything without my consent. So he did agree, sent the anaesthetist in. So I think the fact that I had the epidural in place meant that I was in a very different place. I wasn't in pain. I could have a proper, like, adult conversation, because there's always
Yes.
that thing of like, you're a bit infantilized, aren't you? You're half naked, or you've got a nightie on, you're in a hospital setting, you're in pain, you're very vulnerable. So I felt like a little bit like, because I'd had this pain relief, I could have a normal conversation,
Yes.
which I couldn't have even between contractions. You're recovering from one. Last thing you want to do is have a full-blown conversation.
Yes. Yes.
So that definitely, having proper pain relief in place, made sense, made it easier. And because of that, we could have a proper full conversation. Like I said, for example, I don't want an episiotomy. Can we try it without an episiotomy? And he said, well, yes, we can. And I did end up having an episiotomy because he was saying to me, right, you are starting to tear. Is it okay if it wasn't like, right, I'm going to give you an
Mm.
episiotomy. Okay if I do a small episiotomy, rather than just, well, compared to the other two, it's like I didn't even know until the baby was born it'd been done. So
Right.
if you
Yes.
can see, that's so different, isn't it? Saying, look,
Yes.
even saying beforehand, would you like me to do a episiotomy? Do you want to wait and see? Do you want to, if you start to tear, that kind of proper adult
Yes.
conversation, which is what really, in theory, should happen. It just seemed much more respectful, as I say, than
Yes.
the things were just done to me because this is how I do things.
Yes.
for the episiotomy. And then me saying, for example, when the baby's head was out, I says, can you just stop? Because I really want to touch my baby's head. And I mean, obviously, this is, I'm saying, in a
Yeah.
non-emergency
Yeah.
situation. And just really lovely things like that, that try to
Yes.
kind of maybe honour my birth plan as much as you can in that
Yes.
situation.
Yes.
And things been explained to me, like I remember my midwife saying, you know, you wanted, like I've always wanted delayed cord clamping and a physiological third
Yeah.
stage. Haven't explained to me, you know, we've moved off this path of normal now. So,
Yeah.
you know, we wouldn't recommend a physiological third stage because you don't have all those lovely hormones flowing
Yeah.
anymore. We've already intervened in the
Yeah.
birth process. So we kind of like have to carry on. But it was never like, we can't do this now.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
like, what do you think? Do you know what I mean? And I did
Yeah.
agree to. Whereas, like with the other ones, it's almost like, well, now we're on this path. This is what's
Yeah.
going to happen. You know, this
Yeah.
is what's
Yeah.
going to happen. This is what needs to happen without really consulting me as a fully, you know, functional adult who, you know,
Yes.
be given informed consent. So that definitely, you know,
Yeah.
made it.
I
Yeah,
think I think that's a really important point, being able to have that adult to adult conversation. You're right. It can end up with infantilizing, so that you're not able to have that proper conversation. So I can see that having that pain relief then gives you that chance to have that conversation, and how valuable that is. I think the
yeah,
other thing from what you just said there that really resonated with me is respect, and possibly with that acknowledgement, in terms of, I can think of situations where a woman has said to me beforehand, I really don't want an episiotomy.
mm,
And I've said to her, I know you really don't want an episiotomy. I know, I've heard that. I know that's really important to you. We're now in this situation where I think you really need one.
yeah,
I can see you're starting to tear, or you're going to have a bad tear, or whatever. I know that's what you want, and this isn't what you want.
mm-hmm,
But I now think we need to do this, and it's kind of taking on board. We may or may not then do the episiotomy, but what I'm kind of saying is, I've heard your wishes. I've really understood that this is an important thing to you, that I need to have that really separate discussion and explain why I do or don't now think that that's okay. So I think respect is a big element of it.
yeah, definitely. And I think it's still up to the woman. If she says, no, I don't want one, just go ahead. If I
Yeah,
tear, tear.
exactly.
You should
Yes,
be without banging on and on and on. Say, okay, you know, we'll make
yes,
a note of that. You
yes,
know, that's what you've decided. It's all noted. You know, you've covered yourself as a doctor
yes,
or a midwife. You know, we've discussed this. Adamant doesn't want an episiotomy, and you know, you're kind of covered then, aren't you? I
yeah,
mean, yeah, but definitely that respect, and it is very hard, and it's very hard to advocate for yourself. And normally in like day-to-day life, you can be, you know, very articulate and you can be very confident, but you know, you're in a different world altogether when
yes,
you're
yes,
very difficult. One thing that I just remembered actually is also that made it better, and this is more from a emotional or psychological point of view. I remember the doctor saying to me, and I actually picked up on this when you did your podcast, saying, look, this is a team effort. This is, we're going to do
mm,
this together. And that's exactly what the doctor said. He says, I can't get this baby out on my own. You know,
yes,
something we're doing together. You're going to push. And I don't know whether he was just saying it to inform me, like, you're not just going to lie down and pull the baby out. And
yeah,
maybe it was. But from my point of view, emotionally, that just really helped, because it's like, it's not like I'm at the dentist having a tooth extracted
mm,
and the dentist is doing all the work. You know, I'm the one, yeah, we're doing it as a team. So I am pushing my baby out. My baby isn't
yes,
being pulled out. And even though rationally and logically afterwards, you know, all the people I spoke to, the midwife says, no, the baby can't just be pulled out. It just can't be pulled out. You have to push at the same
yes,
time. On an emotional level, sometimes it can feel like you've been very passive and you're laying there and someone
yes,
does the job for you, as I say,
yeah,
like a tooth extraction. And it's not. And even though, like with my last one, for example, I can tell myself over and over again that didn't happen, sometimes it did feel like that, like I
yes,
didn't really do it. Whereas with that one, I think because I heard it at the time it was happening, something imprinted in my brain to say,
Yes.
like, yeah, you are pushing your baby out. So I think that even just things like that, like the doctors, like you say, you that's what you say. And if like any midwives listen to this, the doctor doesn't say that, the midwife can say that. There's no reason
Yes.
why the midwife can't say, you know what, the doctor can't do this on her
Yeah.
own. So, you know, you really need to push. You're going to be pushing, or, you know, and as your baby's being pushed and moving down, saying, you know, you're pushing your baby out. You know,
Yes.
you are doing it. You are doing it.
Yes.
I think there's something
Yes.
about hearing it as it's happening as opposed to someone telling you afterwards, but you did do it. You
Yes.
did.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a difference. I don't know why. There's something in your brain that just, in my point, from my point of view,
Yes.
that's what happened. That's what happened, you know, to me. Even though with the forceps birth, my baby was much higher up in the pelvis. His head needed to be rotated. You know, lots of things were going on. I had the cord around his
Yeah.
neck and hands, which is why I ended up needing forceps and not the ventouse because he wasn't low enough down. So in theory, with the ventouse births, I did a lot more of the pushing on my
Yeah.
own. We're quite, you know, close to being born compared to the forceps. But the forceps one still feels like I did more, just possibly because of the words that that doctor used
Yes.
at that.
Yes. And you're right. I do say it's teamwork. I say that all the time to women,
Mm,
because it genuinely is that. I'm just adding a little bit, whether that's, like you say, rotating the baby's head into a better position or helping it come down. I genuinely feel that, but it's really nice to hear that that could be a really valuable thing I'm saying, actually. And I think even if you take away the pushing, the way the uterus is working, the way the womb is contracting, we only are pulling when the womb is contracting. You're working with the contractions, you're working with the woman's body. That's
yeah,
how an assisted vaginal birth works. And
yeah,
so, very much, it is not a passive thing. And I think I can see why psychologically that is a really big point that might help if it's said in that moment, because it absolutely is not a passive thing. It's very much working with what's already happening and trying to expedite it is the best word I can think of,
yeah.
really.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, as I say, I'm only speaking on my behalf, but I can't imagine that lots of other women feel very differently to me. And I do remember
Mm,
with my sister, so my sister had two babies before I did. And years later, she said with the second one, again, I think she's had similar, maybe she's built the same way as I've had. She's had three instrumental births. One without any instruments. And she said with one of them, I can't remember, I think it was the second, saying, I felt I really could have done it. I felt I was cheated. She said, I felt like I was cheated out of that birth. And I hadn't given birth at this point, so I didn't know
mm,
what she meant. But looking back now, I 100% understand it. And to use an analogy, how I feel, it's like running a marathon. So you've prepared for it, you've trained for it, you've imagined, and you've got there, and you're right, and you can see the finishing line, it's right there. But all of a sudden, for some reason you fall down and someone runs out of the crowd and they pick you up and carry, and it's like you've done so much to get to where you are, but
yeah,
you've needed help, or even not carrying you, you're limping along, you know, with their arm
yeah,
around them. It's, yeah, you did it, but you also had someone helping you. So it's a funny thing because you know, you
yeah,
logically and rationally you know you did it, but it's like, but I wanted to do that last, those few meters at the end, I didn't, needed help. So anything that can mitigate that feeling of
yes,
failure in inverted commas. You know, we talk a lot
yeah,
about women, you know, you weren't a failure and you weren't, and you were failed in this. But I think to just anything that can mitigate that potential feeling of failure, you know, I just think it really helps. And I do think,
yeah,
like saying it at the time just makes all the difference
yeah,
in the world, definitely. So yeah, listening to this just takes one thing away from this. If that you could just, yeah, actually, I remember talking to that woman, and yeah, that's what it's like running a
yeah,
marathon. Just get to
yeah,
the end. So just say, yeah, you're doing it. You're getting there. You know,
yeah,
you're coming. You're pushing your baby out. You
yeah.
know,
No, I
fantastic.
love that idea of a marathon and not
Yeah,
wanting to be helped over the line. You want to do it yourself. That's a really
yeah,
good way of thinking about it, actually.
yeah. It's like kids, isn't it? When they say, "No, I want to do it," you know, getting dressed, young
Yeah,
children
yeah,
trying to help them, but no, I want. There is that thing of we want to be able to do things, don't we? Want
yes,
agency over our own bodies, and I
yes,
think it all ties. It all ties into that. Yeah.
That's lovely. I wanted you to mention briefly because you sent me a piece you'd written
Hmm.
about birth trauma and how the impact it's had on you. I think the thing that struck me from what you sent me to read was the everyday life things. So if you go to a maternity unit where you've given birth and you've got birth trauma, then
Yeah.
everyone would assume that would be triggering. But I
Yeah.
think the thing that really struck me was that you could be going about doing your normal everyday life and something could trigger you that reminds you of that occasion, which perhaps we as professionals wouldn't appreciate. And the example you gave was the supermarket. And I had
Hmm.
never thought of the fact that people in the supermarket are wearing uniforms and having fluorescent lights and some of
Hmm.
those similarities. So I don't know if you'd be willing to share a little bit about birth trauma and what that's been like to live
Yeah.
with.
Yeah, so as you say, things like that, you would, imagine, yeah, certain situations being in a maternity unit or even another part of the hospital, it's so similar, could be a trigger. But I found this personally, I found the supermarket very triggering. And it was the uniforms, and perhaps it was because it was a dark blue, so it was perhaps the colour of the labour ward, the midwife, I can't remember what her title is, the
Scrubs.
labour ward.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, whatever, the colour she had on, and just the fact that there's the fluorescent lighting, and it's a form of PTSD. I wasn't officially diagnosed with PTSD, but all these are like symptoms of PTSD, being in a completely different environment, nothing to do with the hospital, let alone, maternity ward, but just having those reminders and triggering you. And I think I mentioned this also, there was a pharmacist. So I always ended up in a till that was right opposite the pharmacy desk. And I think that in particular triggered me because that was a very almost clinical setting within a
Mm.
supermarket. And the doctor, he actually did look like the doctor that assisted my baby's
Mm.
birth. And I did end up feeling a bit sorry for him because I used to look at him and think, oh, kind of like feel really annoyed and angry because you're there and triggering me. It wasn't his fault. This guy's just there doing his job. But just, everyday kind of things have the potential to trigger you. And I don't know how to mitigate against that because getting back to this kind of thing of the vulnerability being in labour, even just going into a situation in hospital, even when you're not in labour, I think just the fact that people wear uniforms, for example, in our culture, we see uniform as authority, don't we? So you
Mm.
go in there and they're almost like you're going into their territory to start with, and they're wearing a uniform. So they're almost like they're in charge. And there is that power imbalance, I feel.
Mm.
Even when you're just going in for like any kind of appointment in a hospital, but certainly when you're having a medical procedure or you're in labour, just the nature of the whole fact that you're in there and you're vulnerable, that power imbalance is there. And as I say, I don't know how to kind of mitigate against that and that carrying on in everyday life where you will come into contact with people, as I say, just in your supermarket. And you can avoid it to a degree. You could, shop online, but the fact that it's there, it's like it's very difficult. So I think I don't know. I suppose what I'd say is that if a woman's needs that kind of birth, just bear in mind that it is going to be traumatic on some level. It's going to be traumatic for her because it was never the plan. No one
Mm.
plans. So it's even if you were in hospital, you transferred, or even if you'd started labouring in that room and that had started to happen, but certainly transferring in from like a low risk setting, like an MLU unit or a home birth, as I did, you've already got the trauma of changing from one environment to another. So that
Mm.
already, and then you add this trauma onto it. So I think everyone in the room needs to bear in mind that that woman, on some level, is going to be traumatized with the best will in the world.
Mm.
So really, to try and practice, as much as you can, not that you shouldn't with anyone else, but the empathy and the kindness and the care and the trauma-informed care really, really, really need to be in place while that's
Mm.
happening. Because you don't know how that woman's going to react. She might be 100% fine with it and go and skip off and live her life, or she might be devastated like I
Yeah.
was, and feeling at points where she doesn't want to be alive anymore. So
Yeah.
again, you have to go with the lowest kind of denomination, as in, this kind of birth has the potential to do this to a woman. So let's
Yeah.
be kind to her. Let's really care about her, because that's going to be carried with her, for the rest of her life. She's going to remember
Yes.
birth, and it's going to be carried on into everyday life. And also, the piece that I wrote, I did put some of the suggestions that I had from my point of view, which may not be possible, that could possibly have mitigated. I think, as I say, even with the perfect situation, there's going to be trauma involved in that kind of birth. So what can we do to mitigate it? And for me, one of them was privacy. It's very difficult to have that kind of birth and feel you're not being watched, you're not being viewed. It's like, the lights are switched on. You're kind of there with your legs wide open. And what can we do to kind of, as I say, mitigate that experience for that woman? Some of the things I came up with, as I say, one of them may not be possible. One of them was that I understand that there needs to be bright lights in the room, but over my head, do the lights have to be bright? Is that an option to not have bright lights? And I did speak to, I did a labour ward tour recently, actually a few months ago, of the hospital where I gave birth. And I mentioned this to one of the obstetrician that was there. And she said, which is something I didn't think of, she said, yeah, that potentially it is. If we had lighting where we could have, dim lighting in one part of the room, but bright lights in others, then yes, that could happen. She said, from my point of view, what I find is that going from light to dark, my eyes take a few seconds to adjust. I was looking up to speak to her, and where her head is, it's like, it's not bright. And then I'm looking down again. It's not ideal. As I say, I don't know. That's one of the things I thought, but I'm just thinking it purely from the woman's experience. But I know that would have helped me if that had been possible. Or if not, a spotlight, for example. So the room is dim, but the doctor uses a spotlight. And again, one of the things that this obstetrician came up with was like, yes, we could have a spotlight in the ceiling, but then the women that are birthing in that room that don't need it are looking at this light that's kind of medicalizing the room more than it needs. Needs to. So it's not, I know it's not as simple. All I can do is speak out and say, this is what would have helped. And for people to say, actually, in our unit, could we do that? What could we do? What could we do that? Is that possible? And what would be the challenges? Because if no one says it, you're not going to think about it. And another thing with the lighting, so my baby was born, she was absolutely fine, didn't need any help, she was on my chest. But again, these really bright lights were kept on. And at that point, could we have a spotlight? Because I did have an episiotomy, so I need to be sutured. And could we just have the lights dimmed in the room for the mum and the baby at that point? I kind of spotlight for the doctor to see what they're doing. And then another thing was with being viewed, having the pediatrician and the resuscitator was pretty much, so I was in the bed against one wall and they were on the opposite wall. So they could see everything that was on display. And again, going back to the labour ward when I wasn't in labour was really helpful, because I saw several rooms and I thought, because one of the suggestions that I made that I know another unit does as standard, because I know a midwife who is married to an obstetrician, and she said, in my husband's unit, this is standard. They have the resuscitator and the paediatrician on the side, on the wall at the side. So they're very close to the woman if they're needed, but they can't actually view you from that end of the room. And again, it'll depend on the unit, because when I went back to my hospital, some rooms, yes, you could have done that, but others, it was so small. It's like, well, no, this is the only place we can put the resuscitator. So again, it's just maybe thinking outside the box. And then I wrote this article for AIMS, and the lady from AIMS said to me, one of the things I'm going to take from what you've written is I'm going to advocate for the use of screens. So again, could a screen be used so that, a screen on wheels, so you can just be screened, but it can be whipped away in a second if it's needed to, so that the only person that can view your genitals is the person that you've consented to view your genitals. It's a bit of a free-for-all now. Bright lights on, whoever's in the room can see you. I guess when women say things like this, you felt very exposed and vulnerable. They'll say to you, oh yes, but they see this all the time, it's nothing. And actually looking at you, that paediatrician might be looking over thinking, right, what am I going to do when what will this baby do? You know what I mean? But it's like, it doesn't matter, because the woman's like still exposed. It's like, I don't know how many times that doctor's seen other women's vaginas. He's never seen mine. I've already got one strange man standing between my legs, and now I've got another one at the other end of the room staring in my direction. It's like, is this 100% necessary? It's still that kind of invasion of your dignity and privacy. And I imagine for women who are, rape survivors or sexual assault survivors, that would be pretty harrowing. That could be,
Yes,
pretty
yes,
harrowing. It's not nice for any of us, but added in that extra trauma. And I think the fact that I'm even having to say this speaks a lot, doesn't it?
yeah,
The fact that I'm having to say, hang on, guys, have you ever thought what that woman's actually
yeah,
experiencing?
yeah,
All
yeah,
these people potentially viewing her half naked,
yes,
that it
yeah,
has really been thought about. Maybe it's been thought about, not taken any further. So I think I just need to say it, because if I don't say it, no one's going to think of,
yes,
say it,
yes.
you know.
No,
And
absolutely. I think you're right. Some things are practically quite difficult. Some
yeah,
things actually you can think, yeah, that's actually quite easy. We could easily do that. And to hopefully provoke a bit of thought, and hopefully some people listening to this will go away and just think, oh, in our birth rooms, what could
mm,
we or couldn't we do?
mm,
I'm
mm,
thinking with the spotlight suggestion and the lights, I do sometimes a cesarean with the top lights in the theatre off and just
yeah,
the operating light on, and the same you
yeah,
could do that with an assisted birth.
yeah,
So there are things you can do, and you probably seen that I often say wrong is wrong even if everyone's doing it, and right is right even if no one's doing it. And so little things have to start from somewhere, so hopefully people will grasp some of this and run with it.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just thinking, so normally I end the podcast with the zesty bit, the kind of take home message, and I think there's so much that you've already said that would come into that. But is there anything else that kind of comes to mind? Oh, hang on, the marathon, the end of the marathon,
yeah.
encouraging the woman and helping her understand she is a participant, she is actively birthing her baby, even if she's having some form of assistance. Would that be your zesty bit, or is there anything else you'd want to add?
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, I think that would be my zesty bit, because, as you say, it's probably something that most people don't think about unless you've
Yeah,
experienced yourself, that that's how it could potentially feel for women. So I think, yeah, and everyone in that room, if the doctor doesn't say it for whatever reason, then there's going to be other people in the room that can be saying it. So I think, yeah, that would be my zesty bit, to actually let the woman know she is birthing her baby with some help, and
mm,
I just think it makes such a difference to be saying that at the time rather than afterwards. So yeah, I think that would be, as you call it, your zesty bit. If every woman having that kind of birth was hearing that at the time, then I think it would make psychologically, emotionally easier. Not perfect, but it would make it easier,
yeah,
definitely.
perfect. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I
No,
I I feel that's been a really excellent conversation that I really hope will inspire people to go back
yeah.
and just think a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I also just quickly wanted to say, lastly, even though it's just me, one person, one woman saying this, it's almost like the women that speak out, you're almost like the tip of the iceberg, because
Yeah,
there's also the women behind me that don't speak out because they don't know whether birth could be any different, or they've just had a baby and they're exhausted, or they just want to move on. They don't want to talk about it. So I feel like I'm speaking for like 99 women who come behind me who are not going to say, and the women who are coming after me. So it's not just I'm the only person that's experiencing it. Of course, I'm not. I'm the one that's speaking out and saying how it can be. And I'm not
yes,
speaking on every single woman that's had this type of birth, but this is how it can be, and it probably is for a lot of women as well. So
yes. Thank you very, very much. I very much hope you found this episode of the OBS Pod interesting. If you have, it'd be fantastic if you could subscribe, rate, and review on whatever platform you find your podcasts, as well as recommending the OBS Pod to anyone you think might find it interesting. There's also tons of episodes to explore in my back catalogue, from clinical topics, my career and journey as an obstetrician, and life in the NHS more generally. I'd like to assure women I care for that I take confidentiality very seriously, and take great care not to use any patient identifiable information unless I have expressly asked the permission of the person involved on that rare occasion when it's been absolutely necessary. If you found this episode interesting and want to explore the subject a little more deeply, don't forget to take a look at the programme notes where I've attached some links. If you want to get in touch to suggest topics for future episodes, you can find me at the ObsPod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can email me theobspod@gmail.com. Finally, it's very important to me to keep the ObsPod free and accessible to as many people as possible. But it does cost me a very small amount to keep it going and keep it live on the internet. So if you've enjoyed my episodes and by chance you do have a tiny bit to spare, you can now contribute to keep the podcast going and keep it free via my link to buy me a coffee. Don't feel under any obligation, but if you'd like to contribute, you now can. Thank you for listening.